Hey guys, it's Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. Today we are going to update your No Limit Hold'em game. So if you've been playing sort of a antiquated, old, circa 2000, old school, tight aggressive game, where you're limping in with suited connectors and trying to take cheap flops with pocket pairs, and trying to see some flops with suited aces, and just playing very razor fold with your double broadways. That's about it. If you're gonna open, I don't know, 10-9 suited on the button, and if you face a 3-bet from the big blind, you just know you're always beat and fold your cards. If you're not doing anything but say flat calling with ace-5 suited on the button versus a cutoff open, and if you're you're ISO raising, or if you're 3-betting, let's say, aggressively against looser, more aggressive players. Let's say you've got a Gus Hansen type player to your direct right, and you've got King Queen offsuit, King Jack suited, Ace 10 suited, pocket nines. If he open raises, if you're really just thinking, well, I need to 3-bet now because I've got the best hand and I want to charge him an unfair price to draw against me, I don't want to give him a free flop, any of that nonsense, we've got some work to do. So the main problems, and this is for me going back to the year 2000, maybe to about 2006, where we were all all of us that were reading and studying the game, were coming up with these ideas. We were reading about these things and thinking about these things, but we didn't have the right axioms in place. I mean, that's the big problem. It's really not the case that modern thinking is just a more evolved form of antiquated thinking. It's actually like the whole thing had to be thrown out. We had to start over. We didn't have the idea of ranges as a concept. When I started thinking about poker and playing seriously, there wasn't such a thing as a range. Like, nobody talked about it. It wasn't thought of. We had very flawed notions about why we would bet. What kind of sizing we would use and what the reasons to bet were. We had like a full arsenal of different bets. We had like probe bets and blocker bets and blocking bets and bluff bets and semi-bluffs and value bets and just tons of it. We had a showdown raise where we would raise hoping to get a free showdown. Like a lot of different bets, and really, like, the more sophisticated a player was back then, the more bets they had, and that was definitely the wrong axiom. What I think the more modern approach has been, and I think this is true of all things that evolve, is efficiency, not complexity. Efficiency is the hallmark of greatness, I guess we could say. Indoctrinated ranges. Okay, I don't think that's a terrible thing. We had to start somewhere. We had specific hands, and pretty much everybody knew that you'd open this from this position, you'd fold this from that position, you'd limp this, you'd limp that from this position, but not that position. I guess, like, you back then had players that knew what the ranges were, or, well, the starting hands by position were, and players who didn't, and that was about it. But I think we had the wrong hands, for one thing, and the idea that this should be such a stringent indoctrination was off. This should really be a more organic situation, and we tried to make it more of a static scenario, and it's not static. It's everything in poker is situational. And then there were some specific misconceptions that were just either evolved. Some of these things evolved. If you think about, like, there had to be a metagame, there was a population tendency, and some types of playing styles were going to win the most against the other playing styles in that population or in the metagame. So some of these misconceptions grew out of things. They evolved out. Like, for instance, that tight is right and tighter is righter, right? Like, we wanted to play super tight and very aggressive when we came into a pot, and that's a really good strategy if most of the field are just calling stations that they play way too loose pre-flop, and then they play very honestly and fit or fold post-flop. Then the greatest thing you could do is just play, if they play fit or fold, but then they get sticky. They get very sticky, meaning like if they hit anything, they're not folding, and if they hit nothing, they're not calling or raising. If you're playing against that specific type of opponent that made up most of the metagame in 2006, the best thing you can do is play a very tight and aggressive strategy pre-flop. Always make that C bet. Always make your continuation bet, because you're going to fold them out when they miss, which is most of the time. And then if you get called, if your opponent continues against you, only keep putting money in the pot when you've got the best hand, when you've got a big hand. I mean, that was it. That's all you had to do. The problem was thinking that because that worked then in that environment, that was the best way to play. It wasn't the best way to play. It was the best way to play against that population. So, what is all this talk about ranges? Well, when you don't think about ranges, you're just playing your hand. And, I mean, in any given hand, I guess you are just playing your hand. But if you're not thinking about the other hands in your range, then it's too likely that you're going to be playing your hand incorrectly in the big picture and in this here and now, just in this one decision point at a time. One misconception I think players have about game theory, in a GTO strategy, there are no loss leaders. You're never making a suboptimal play or a slightly negative EV play for the benefit of your overall strategy. You're just playing every hand as profitably as you can at GTO, at equilibrium, at Nash. If you're, back in the day, if you were putting your opponent on a hand, you were like ahead of the curve. If you were, maybe trying to narrow your opponent's hands down to a couple of most likely hands, that was really good. So at best, putting villain on a hand, maybe a couple hands, it's not good enough. The problem is even if you've managed to tease out what a couple of likely hands in your opponent's range might look like, or be rather, then it's very possible that the action that you would want to take, if your opponent actually has the most likely hand in their range, is not the action you'd want to take against their range at large or as a whole. An example might illustrate what I'm talking about. Okay, so there is this idea that if your opponent, if you know that your opponent is only going to 4-bet ace, king, aces, kings, or queens, which was very often the case. I mean, really in most casinos today it still is the case, that if you see a 4-bet, that player has probably queens, kings, or aces, maybe ace, king, but probably weighted towards aces and kings quite a bit. But let's just say that you knew for sure that your opponent had either kings, aces, or ace, king. Let's say you have queens, and you don't think that your opponent would take this 4-bet with queens. You would flat, and you block them, so you can just about eliminate them. So if you know your opponent has either ace, king, kings, or aces, what should you do when you 3-bet and your opponent rips in 150 big blinds against you? Of course, that does depend on the pot odds, but just let's say it's a really big overbet, which it often would be. If you have queens, can you call against a player who's only going to take this line with ace, king, kings, or aces? Well, the way they used to reason it out, the way I used to reason it out, the rationale I used to use was that even if you know your opponent has ace, king, kings, or aces, it's still more likely that your opponent has ace, king than it is aces or kings combined. So the probability, there's just more combos of ace, king than there are kings and aces put together. So if you know that your opponent's most likely hand is ace, king, it would be tragic to fold pocket queens against him. But that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is you don't put your opponent on a hand, you put them on a range. And if your opponent's range is aces, kings, and ace, king, you cannot call a big shove with pocket queens. It's crazy. And I can't believe that I used to think that was okay. I fell for that. I don't know how that's possible, but yeah, that's a real thing. People used to think like that. And if you're thinking like that, stop it. It's nonsense. Get Equilab. I don't think you can still get Poker Stove, but Equilab I think is better anyway. It's a free program. Download it, play with it. I believe Poker Stove and Equilab were what led to the development of the concept of ranges. You can put ranges into Equilab, you could put ranges into Poker Stove, and you could do that before they were called ranges. So I think that was probably it. Thinking in ranges helps to avoid pitfalls like I thought he had ace king and I didn't want to let him draw for free. These are misconceptions. These are misnomers. Like, even if the most overt part of your opponent's 3-betting range is ace king, it does not mean you should play as if you were playing against ace king. If all of your opponent's range is either ace king or hands that beat you, you cannot just assume that they've got ace king. And it seems so silly and so obvious now, but back then I remember, like, hey, the pros, the best players in the world, they're able to put their opponent on a hand. I want to do that. So you practice, you try to think, what hand does my opponent have? And it just happens to be the case that ace king is very often the most likely holding that your opponent could have. That does not mean that you should play against your opponent as if he's holding ace king. That's not the same thing. It can be the case that the most likely single hand that your opponent can have is ace king. But still, that when you add up all of his range together, he still probably doesn't have ace king. It can be the most likely single combo that he could have, or the most likely combos that he could have contain an ace and a king. But when you add up all the other less likely combos together, they are much more likely than ace king. And the other big problem, I didn't want to let him draw for free. I think that thought process, I didn't want to let him draw for free, came from just normal human risk aversion or loss aversion. You are just, as a human being, you're just more prone to putting more attachment and value onto the things that you have than things that you could gain. Human beings are irrationally risk averse out of the gate. If you went to 100 people on the street and you could, somehow you could manage to convince them that you had a fair coin, or you could use a coin out of their pocket and just flip it heads or tails, would they like to gamble their $10 against your $10? You're going to get an overwhelmingly large number of no responses. If you lay them odds 11 to 10, they're still not going to take it. The average is, I just saw a video on this, I think it was a video. Anyway, I just heard this from Vsauce. I think this was on Vsauce. Anyway, it turns out that it takes the average person 2 to 1. Like, you have to offer them 20 to 10 before they start actually thinking it's okay to gamble with that flip of a coin. That's just our nature. Our nature is to put more attachment to not losing what we have than on trying to maximize what we could gain. And I didn't want to let him draw out on me. It comes from that. And it comes also from, I think, an incorrect axiom, like a starting point that we had that was something like the game of poker is about winning pots, and everything else was sort of secondary. We wanted to win the pot, and so if we could make a bet that would win the pot, most of the time that's what we would do. We wanted to price our opponent out if they had a draw. So anytime the board was two-tone, we would be very, very reluctant to take like a check and call line or a pot control line. We didn't want to bet flop, check, turn, call, river with our top pair, second kicker type hands, because we didn't want to give up a pot that we could win, regardless of how the actual EV lines up in both cases. If we felt like we were entitled to that pot, we want to collect it. We don't want to let it slip away, even if on average we will make more money by taking a bet, check, call line. We're still too nervous, overly nervous, and actually it turns out irrationally nervous about letting free cards that could potentially improve our opponent's hands roll off. We never think about, what if we're behind, then we're actually giving ourselves a chance to hit. But I digress. Yeah, the idea that every time that there's a two-tone flop, your opponent has a flush draw is nonsense. It's nonsense. Your opponent very, very rarely has a flush draw. It's more likely, like any two suited cards, having cards of the same suit is actually pretty unlikely, and sometimes the board blocks most of the suited connectors your opponent could have in that suit anyway. Like when the board comes out like King, Jack, 9, two-tone, pretty much no matter how you scramble that out. But especially if it's like king jack 9 with the jack of spades and the 9 of spades, like what suited connectors does your opponent have that don't have a 9 or a jack in them? There's not that many. If they called pre-flop or I guess if they raise pre-flop too, there's just not that many suited connectors that most people will play in most situations. But you have to look at the board and see what suited hands even make sense, and then realize that if there's a couple of combos that make sense, it's so unlikely that your opponent has that combo that is suited. It's much more likely to have pocket eights than it is to have 9-8 suited. There's only exactly 4 ways to make 9-8 suited, and once you see the 9 of that suit, so I guess the point is your opponent doesn't always have a flush draw, okay, and you can't play every flop that has a two-tone flop as if your opponent has a flush draw and expect that to be the best strategy, because again, your opponent does not have a flush draw the vast majority of the time, and even if there's multiple opponents, your opponents still normally do not have a flush draw among themselves. Most flops, by the way, are going to be two-tone. I mean, there's 3 cards out there, there's only 4 suits. Most of those flops are going to be two-tone flops. It's rainbow flops are the rare exception, they're not the rule. So if you play every flop that's two-tone as if your opponent has a flush draw, you're going to be wrong so often. And even if you happen to be right this time, it's not that big of a deal to let your opponent have a free card. It's not like you're going to see 3 spades come off and you've got like second pair and you're just going to lose your mind and stack off against his made flush. And really, it's not that likely, even if he does have a flush draw, that he's going to hit his flush draw. I mean, it's 4-1 against on the next card, So we can't really have this. We can't live in fear of losing a pot we could have won. The object of the game is not to win pots. And I think if you start thinking in ranges, what hands can my opponent have, instead of just thinking in weird kind of ethereal concepts like I don't want my opponent to win, think in ranges. A lot of this just changes. Once you start thinking in ranges, the game completely changes. It opens up. It looks like something new and different. It looks like a totally new game, unique, and you see all of the things you used to do as so silly. They didn't make any sense. If you're not thinking in ranges, your game doesn't make sense. I can just about promise you. I mean, unless you're like, pretty much guaranteed. Thinking in ranges allows you to avoid being easily exploited. If you're not thinking in ranges, if you're not thinking how far up the distribution of hands that I could have is this hand that I'm holding now, how do you know when to call a bluff? It doesn't, what are you doing? What are you doing to decide? If you think your opponent might be bluffing, how on earth do you know whether to call or not? I mean, you can't, right? If you're not thinking about ranges, if you're not thinking about blockers, if you're not thinking about what part of your range you're holding, then how do you know what hands to call with and what hands to fold when you can only beat a bluff? You're just gambling. If you're not thinking in ranges, you could be very easily exploited. If you're calling with too many of your bluff catchers, your opponent can just stop bluffing you, and you're going to get mauled. You're going to get destroyed. If you're not calling with enough bluff catchers, your opponent can bluff every time he has a bluffing hand. You're going to get murdered. You can't do that. You got to start thinking in ranges. If you're not, then it's just really, if you're not thinking in ranges and your opponents aren't thinking in ranges, you guys are just gambling. It's just whoever's strategy happens to accidentally look most like a strategy that would be good if you were thinking in ranges, it's a total accident. If you're a winning player and you're not thinking in ranges and equity, and you're not, if you're still thinking this like antique thought process, and if you're a winning player at your local casino, it's an accident. You're not good at poker. I'm sorry. It's true. You might be better than your opponents, but you can't be that much better. I don't think you can be so much better that you beat the rake in today's games without thinking at least a little bit better than your opponents. Like in terms of, everybody knows not to call a raise with 7-2 offsuit. Everybody knows to typically 3-bet aces pre-flop. Everybody knows to usually go for 3 streets in a live cash game with top pair, top kicker, and overpair. What are you doing that's better than what your opponents are doing? If you're not doing much that's better, then you're not going to beat the rake. Bet theory is another way you can tighten up your game and really get an edge on your opponents because of this principle of they call it the principle of reciprocality. I'm not sure. I haven't ever looked actually, but I have a feeling reciprocality is not a real word. Well, it's like we already have a word for that. It's called reciprocity. So, but it's not my theory. So the theory of reciprocality states that whenever you do something that your opponent is unable or unwilling to do, you gain an advantage. Anything your opponent does and this doesn't have to be a poker game, by the way. This could be somebody at work who's competing for the same position as you are. So anything that your, opponent is not necessarily the right term. Competition. Whatever your competition does that you can't do or are unwilling to do is their advantage. And anything you can or are willing to do that your opposition is not willing and or able to do becomes your advantage. And that's the only edge that there is in poker. It works for everything. If you're if you're more willing to study and learn and read and watch videos than your opponents, then that's your edge. Because they're not reciprocating. You're doing this thing that they're either unable or unwilling to reciprocate, and that works to your advantage. That's your edge. If you're better at folding big hands when you're beat than your opponent, that's an edge. So if you don't have these, always ask yourself, what am I doing that's better than what my opponents are doing? If you can't think of anything, you probably don't have an edge at all. So bet theory is a way to tighten up your game and gain an edge. This is just the very basic, most fundamental tenet of bet theory. The larger a bet, the more hands should fold. The stronger and more narrow the continuance range becomes. That's it. Now, that's what bets do. That's what bets do. That's all bets do. That's the only thing a bet does. If somebody bets against you, the larger they bet, the more hands you should fold. You're not letting them screw you over. You're not like, oh, he's betting so big, he's probably bluffing, I can't fold. No. The larger a bet, the more hands you should fold. That's just it. I mean, it just is what it is. You don't want to fight this. It's a bad idea. I hear there's a podcast called the Post Flop Poker Podcast, and these guys, I listen to it, honestly. I listen to it every once in a while because I think it's funny. Seriously, it's like a guilty pleasure. I'll advertise for the guys. Why not? They're fun guys. They're cool guys. They seem really nice. One of them is a poker coach. The other guy wrote a book on poker, and they're terrible. Their thought process is just so crazy. I'll tell you, listening to the podcast is like watching that scene from the Princess Bride? The Princess Bride. I think it's the Princess Bride, where you've got the masked man and the Sicilian playing a game of death, where the guy puts poison in one cup and not the other, and puts his hands behind his back, mixes them around, sets them in front. The Sicilian says, well, you being a strong man, you would probably put the cup that has the poison in front of you. But knowing that I'm a smart guy, you would expect that I would know that. So me knowing that, you expecting me to know that, means that you would clearly never put the cup in front of you, so I clearly cannot choose that cup. But you would have known that I knew that, so I clearly cannot choose this cup. However, if you thought that I thought that you'd think that, and it goes on and on and on, and it's much better, more well put together than all of that. But the Thinking Poker podcast sounds just like it. It's like, well, didn't you think that because he bet so big that he was probably bluffing, and didn't that make you more? It's like, yeah, I did, but then I thought he would think that I thought that, so clearly, it's comical. It really is comical. But in reality, the larger your opponent's bet, the higher percent of your range needs to fold. And the other end of that is the larger you bet, the more hands you should expect your opponents to fold. And if it's not the case, if you find a situation where your opponents are going to call large bets and small bets with approximately the same percentage of their range, then you found a thing that you can beat up on. They are extremely exploitative in that now you can bluff small and value bet large and just murk them, just destroy them. If you can bluff small and get the same number of folds that you would with a large bluff, and you can value bet large and get the same number of calls you would with a small value bet, there's no way they should be able to beat you. It's called being inelastic. If your opponents have inelastic calling ranges, the most exploitative thing you can do is simply bluff smaller and value bet larger. Don't fall into that trap yourself. Don't play mind games and level yourself. Get rid of leveling. Forget it. It's just silly. And if you're not thinking about bet theory, you're not thinking about like how to size your bets, how to value target specific parts of your opponent's range. If you're thinking about making a bet, just ask yourself, what does this bet accomplish? Why am I betting? Does it really make sense for me to toss out this bet right now? If you're betting for emotional reasons, cut it out. You want to bet to target specific parts of your opponent's range. If you think, well, okay, if I make this bet, then I've got these hands in my opponent that my opponent could have that will fold. That's bluffing. That's you figure out what kind of bet sizing you're going to use and how many bluffs you're getting to this spot with, how many value bets you're getting to this spot with. And if you have like 8 value bets in your range, then maybe you have like a pot-sized bet left and you're going to jam the river, then you can bring in 4 bluff combos and get this 2-to-1 value to bluff ratio and pick the 4 best bluff hands and think about your entire range. Don't just think about the hand that you're holding, and then figure out if the hand that you're holding falls into that bluffing range or if it doesn't. Bluffing ratios, bluffing percentages come out of bet sizing. Pot geometry comes out of, actually bet sizing more stems from pot geometry. Pot geometry is understanding what does this bet do to the size of the pot on the next street. If you're not thinking about pot geometry now, and you start thinking about it tomorrow, you will be better at poker tomorrow. Like the next time you have a set, look at your opponent's stack, look at your stack. If you're thinking, I would just like to get stacks in, what's the best way to do that? Well, if you understand pot geometry, you'll be able to figure it out. You need to think about, if I make this bet and it gets called, how big will the pot be? Then, how much stack size will I have left? How much stack will I have behind? How much will I have to bet on the turn in order to set up a good river jam where I can bet about the same percent on each street? That's really what you're trying to do. If you've got like a polarized range, and you've especially like if you've got the value end of your polarized range and you think your opponents are kind of insensitive to bet sizing, then you just want to use the biggest bet size that you can on each street that gets you all in by the river, while using the same percent of the pot on each street. So if you can set it up so that you make a pot-sized river jam, and before that you make a pot-sized turn bet, and before that you make a pot-sized maybe check raise on the flop, that's perfect. If you're pot-sized jam on the river, if it gets you all in by betting the size of the pot, and you also bomb the turn for pot, and you check raise the flop pot-sized, then that's the perfect ratio. That's the perfect pot geometric bet sizing on each street. It's often easier to figure it out in reverse. You can get a real basic intuition about it from just thinking about these spots off the table, like outside it, like when you're not playing, and figure out, okay, if I bet $100 into $100 and get called, that's going to leave $300. So if I have a $400 stack, then I can bet 100 on the flop or on the say turn, and then bet 300 on the river. And that's like your perfect sizing with a polarized range, whether you've got the bluff and or the value end of it. And range manipulation comes out of bet theory in a way too. Well, I mean, I guess it directly comes out of it's the exact. This is the direct result of bet theory. Remember, bet theory says the larger a bet is, the more hands should fold. And really every bet, this is going to happen. Every time there's a bet or a raise, some hands fold. If you know that some of your opponent's hands will fold, then you know that if you call, your opponent's going to have one range of hands. But if he bets and you raise, he's going to have another set of hands. So think about that before you mindlessly throw out a 3-bet. Next time you have some very aggressive player to your right and you're holding a hand like King Queen on the button, and you're thinking, well, I've definitely got a stronger hand than him on average. I'm ahead of his range, so why don't I just raise here and because I've got the best hand? Well, first of all, having the best hand is not a reason to bet. It just isn't. That's not one of the reasons that you bet. Because I had the best hand. Having the best hand does not make you money. How do you how does that make you money? If you knew that you had the best hand with King Queen, know that your opponent's going to fold if you 3-bet, then it doesn't matter if you have king-queen. If you 3-bet, it doesn't matter if you have the best hand. You could have done that with 7-2 offsuit. If your opponent's going to fold to a 3-bet, your hand doesn't matter if you 3-bet it. So what's a better idea? Maybe we should take a line that makes our hand matter. If we think that we've got our opponent really crushed, if he's opening a ton of hands but he's folding to a lot of 3-bets, which, you know, is kind of your average loose-aggressive nutcase, and you know what, if he wants to call 3-bets out of position and play a bunch of flops and inflated pots out of position, that's another thing we can talk about. I mean, that's not good for him either. So if he's opening too wide and he's folding too tight to your 3-bets, then you should polarize your 3-betting range. You don't want to 3-bet hands like king-queen and ace-10 suited and king-jack suited that are going to really crush and really dominate a lot of the hands that he's likely to open when you've got the best hand, when you've got position, maybe a playing skill advantage post-flop. The last thing you want is to fold out all the hands that you crush, especially when you could use other parts of your range to do that. Like you could use ace-5 suited that's got the ace blocker, and it's going to get as many folds as king-queen, maybe more folds because of the ace blocker than king-queen. You don't make additional money by having the best hand when your opponent folds. That's a big thing to understand. You do not have you do not get paid extra when you had the best hand. If your opponent folds, you get the same pot that your opponent if your opponent folds, and there are no more opponents, if your only opponent folds, you get to win the pot regardless of whether you had the best hand or the worst hand. So why not use a 3-betting range in position against a player like that is more like aces, kings, queens, and ace-king, and a bunch of junk for balance, you know, like ace-5 suited, king-7 suited, maybe even ace-5 offsuit, ace-2 suited, ace-3. You know, like most of your suited wheel aces, those make really good light 3-bets because they have the ace blocker that makes it a little more likely your opponent doesn't have an ace, which makes it a little more likely he's light, which makes it a little more likely that he folds, and probably a lot more likely that he doesn't, or I don't know, a good bit more likely that he doesn't 4-bet you, which would be the worst thing. So why not use hands like, you know, the hands that are not quite good enough to call his raise with, use those to 3-bet as a bluff, you know. They're almost good enough to call with. So why would you start folding hands like ace-5 suited that are almost good enough to call with, and 3-bet bluff hands like 7-2 offsuit that are nowhere near good enough? Like, why would you ever want to fold ace-5 suited in the same spot that you're 3-betting, I don't know, 7-5 offsuit? Choose your bluffs out of the hands that are almost good enough to call with but not quite, and that have the best blocker effects and the best equity if you get called. Usually that's going to put you in like the ace-x suiteds that aren't good enough to call with area, like maybe ace-8 suited type hands and ace-5 suited down, like maybe ace-7 suited, ace-8 suited, ace-5 suited and under. And if you're playing in a live cash game, that's probably enough hands to 3-bet for to balance out your, you know, just few value combos that you're going to 3-bet. You're going to 3-bet aces, kings, queens, and probably ace-queen, or ace-king, maybe ace-queen suited. But don't take hands that have perfectly good flopping value that crush your opponent's range, especially when you're in position, but that aren't going to get called by worse hands, aren't going to fold out better hands, and can't stand a 4-bet, and start 3-betting those hands. That's silly. Don't 3-bet ace-10 suited on the button versus a cutoff open almost ever. Just flat it. Take a flop. You've got probably the best hand, you've got position, and hopefully you've got a skill advantage. Don't waste that hand by 3-betting it, right? So that's kind of what the concept of range manipulation is like, if I 3-bet my opponent with my ace-10 suited, now he's calling me with a stronger range. He's calling me with hands that probably largely have me crushed, whereas if I flat call from the button against a cutoff open, then I leave all of his bluffs intact, I leave his lightest value hands intact, I leave all the stuff I beat still in his range. That makes it so that I can play more profitably against that range post-flop. Incorrect indoctrinated starting hands. The hands you can and should play change based on many factors. Okay, you can't just say that we should play these hands in these positions. Position is one of the factors. It's a big factor. But you have to also look at stack depth. If your effective stacks are 40 big blinds in some tournament, or I don't know, against a bunch of fish that just haven't capped their stacks off in a cash game, you can't take set mines with pocket fives when your opponent's raising like 5 times, 6 times the big blind. It's not gonna be okay. But if you've got a lot of stack depth, if you're playing 200 big blinds deep, you should almost never pass on a set mine, especially in position. What are you, crazy? No. So the number of opponents in the hand, that's going to change how well your hands play. Hands like suited connectors, ace-x suiteds, arguably probably pocket pairs, most of your pocket pairs. I would say maybe there's an argument that your smallest pocket pairs don't want like half the table in there. You don't want to get over. It's so expensive to get oversetted, and you're not going to hit a set very often anyway. I could see that there might be some ideal number of players for small pocket pairs, but I mean, in general, you're going to want more than one opponent when you've got pocket pairs, suited connectors, some of your suited broadways if you're in position. Some of those hands are just not going to be playable unless you've got enough opponents, or they're going to need to be 3-bet. Like, let's say that you have 7-6 suited on the button. You definitely can open this if nobody comes into the pot, and if there's like a call, like if there's a raise and a call, then now you can probably just go ahead and come in for a call if you're deep enough. You've got enough of your stack, if effective stacks are big enough. So stack depth is a big thing. Number of opponents is a big thing. Position is a big thing. But what I was saying with the 7-6 suited, if you only have one player that comes in the pot, your hand might not be strong enough to call with, so maybe you should think about 3-betting it. It might be good enough to call with on the button, but you're going to have to be deep enough. And you're going to have to know that your opponent does some things badly that you understand. Again, if you don't know how you're going to make money with a hand post-flop, you probably shouldn't play it. Or if you think you can make money with it pre-flop, then go ahead. But some hands are going to be good enough to call in some spots, but not quite good enough to call in other spots, but you should 3-bet them in those other spots. Ace-5 suited is probably a good example. If there's a raise and 2 callers, it may be perfectly fine to just flat call Ace-5 suited on the button, whereas if a middle position player open raises, I don't think you probably want to flat call Ace-5 suited even from the button at most stack depths. So all of these things, tendencies of your opponents, your villain's tendencies. If you're in a tournament, ICM is real. It's a real big deal. You can't just play the same hands regardless of what the ICM considerations are. That's independent chip model. It refers to like bubble pressure, and pay jumps, and the difference between TEV and EV. Like, there is a difference. You get mathematically penalized for winning the tournament. You get a big mathematical bonus for losing after other players lose. So it's not the same as EV. It's different, and it can change the hands that you should or should not play. If you're playing in a satellite where all, say, the top 3 prizes are exactly the same, there's plenty of spots where it's absolutely correct to fold pocket aces before the flop. Let's say that you've got 100 big blinds and there's 3 spots left. They all pay the same, like a satellite would. And you are the second chip leader with 100 big blinds. The next best stack has 101 big blinds, and there's 3 other players, and they all have 2 big blinds apiece, or say just enough to cover the big blind once apiece. If the one stack that can take you out moves all in, you should fold aces. It's just, even if you call, like, if you call him, even if you are, like 80% to win, well, let's say that you're 75, 76% to win against his range. You got to be a much bigger favorite than that to win one of these seats if you just fold and let one of these tiny little stacks bust out. In fact, you could probably just walk away from the table at that point and never play another hand. The only time you should be playing another hand is if you're doing the raising, or you think you've got an edge to try to pick off one of the small stacks. You really shouldn't be playing against the other guy that can bust you, unless you can put him all in and he understands ICM. Probably not a good idea to assume that, though. Your basic strategy is going to matter a lot too. I don't want to say that multiple strategies can be equally correct. Okay, yes I do. I want to say that you can have different strategies that are equally correct. two players can have their own strategies as long as they're balanced, as long as they're put together with the right ideas. They can have different strategies that are both winning about the same amount. So many hands are so close to break even. I bet you one player could play twice as many hands as another player, but both of them be, at about the same EV. So yeah, your basic strategy can be a lot different than another player's basic strategy. What I was trying to think is, can they both be the same distance from Nash equilibrium? And I think they both can be. Yeah, certainly they could both be. Now, there is only one perfect strategy, and you're just either playing that perfect strategy in that situation or you're not. But even perfect is sort of a relative term, because perfect actually means how would it do against another player that was playing perfectly. A perfect strategy oftentimes won't be the best strategy to use against a player who isn't playing a perfect strategy. If one player is not playing a Nash equilibrium, which nobody is because nobody knows it, if you can figure out where you think his deviations, like how far he is from Nash and why, in what ways, then you can probably make more money moving further away from Nash equilibrium than you already are, in order to take advantage of or exploit the strategy, the leaks in your opponent's games. Got off topic, I digress. But your basic strategy, how you've decided to play, is another thing that's going to influence the hands that you're going to want to start with. And the metagame considerations, like what are the population tendencies? How do the players in this population play? If they're all very calling station type hands, or players rather, then you should add more hands. If they're all weak players that fold too much pre-flop, then you should play more hands. Yeah, that's actually a fact. The distance your opponent is from Nash can never cause you to play fewer hands. It just can change the hands that you ought to play. If your opponents don't play enough hands, you should bluff raise more often. If they play too many hands, you should value raise thinner. Either way, you're playing more hands, not fewer hands than you would at equilibrium. But the metagame is going to change the way that you play the hands and the actual construction of your ranges, which hands you should play and which hands you shouldn't play. Now let's look at some specific misconceptions, and there's tons of these. And I think I'm going to start doing some videos about the misconceptions. I had a really hard time narrowing it down to just 4, but I didn't want this video to go too long. So, reasons to bet. Okay, in my opinion, in my view, from my perspective, there are exactly 2 reasons to bet. I don't think it's possible for there to be more than a few, and there could, depending on your perspective, just be one. That one reason to make a bet would be because it's plus EV to bet. Right now, that's strictly true, but it doesn't really convey much information. It's not very helpful to know that. If somebody asks, if you have a coach and you ask, what are the reasons to bet? If he tells you, well, there's only one reason to bet, you bet when it's plus EV to do so, be a little leery about that guy. Give him another chance maybe, but he might just be full of shit, because that is true. It is true, but of course it's true. That's like saying, why is the sun hot? Because the temperature's high. It doesn't convey any information. It's completely accurate, but it doesn't convey anything. You're not learning anything to hear it. In my view, there are 2 reasons to bet. And these are different perspectives is all they are. But I think it makes sense to bet anytime getting money in the pot is likely to build a pot where you are a favorite to win the pot. So you should bet hoping that your opponent will call when you are a favorite to win the pot, either before showdown or at showdown. That's not the same as a value bet, because sometimes we're semi-bluffing with the intention of barreling. Like sometimes I'm betting a draw, and I think that even though I don't have the best hand against their calling range, I still want them to call, because just the board, the state of the board, my opponent's range, whatever the dynamics are that are set up between us so far, I just really feel like whatever money my opponent puts in on the flop, I'm going to get more than half of it in the long run by barreling turns and barreling rivers. When I have a good chunk of equity, I'm going to have, through some combination of my opponent folding on the flop, folding on the turn, folding on the river, and me making the best hand, I'm just going to win more than half the money that goes into the pot. It's not a value bet then, although it still counts as making money when your opponent calls. So you can look at it sort of as a value bet. It's just, it really value and bluff only is not sufficient. It doesn't answer everything. But I think my two, bet anytime you are a favorite to win the pot at or by showdown, and the second reason, fold when it is to your advantage that your opponent, or fold in the hopes of getting your opponent to relinquish their equity in the pot. So is that bluffing? Yeah, that can be bluffing. Just like the first reason or first rationale can be value betting, but it can also be semi-bluffing. The second rationale, the second reason to bet just to get your opponent to fold their equity, it can be a bluff. That's great. That's a slam dunk. If you can bet and get your opponent to fold more equity than you have, that's fantastic. But sometimes you can make a bet with a hand like maybe you 3-bet ace-2 suited pre-flop and the flop comes down like king-7 deuce. Well, you still maybe should bet, or especially if it's more like jack-9 deuce, right? You still should maybe bet, even though you don't expect your opponent to fold anything better or call with anything worse. So you could call that a protection bet if you want, but I just don't think you need that term protection. I think, like, what are you protecting? I think that is that's still leftover BS from a time when we thought the object of the game was to win pots. This idea of protecting your hand. You're not protecting anything, you're just getting your opponent to fold. You could look at it like turning your bottom pair into a semi-bluff, because if you bet and get called, you're beat, but you have 5 outs to improve to a pretty strong hand. Aces up, trips. So is it a semi-bluff? Is it a protection bet? Is it a value bet against floats? No, it's just a bet hoping your opponent will fold, right? So you're trying to fold out your opponent's equity, just like if you were bluffing. Same thing with a value bet or a semi-bluff. That's, a strong enough semi-bluff. Sometimes your semi-bluff is like you've got 2 overcards with a gut shot straight draw and the nut flush draw. It's pretty tough to call that a bluff, right? Like, you're sad if you bet the flop and your opponent folds, you're not happy about it, so it's hard to call it a bluff, but you probably aren't getting called by anything worse in that moment unless it's a worse draw, I guess. Bad example, but you get the point. There aren't a billion reasons to bet. There's probably 2. There might be, you could look at like value betting, bluffing, semi-bluffing as different things, and you could throw in this other thing like it sometimes kind of makes sense to bet for protection or whatever. You could get a little, goofy with it, or make it a little more complex than it has to be, but I think you could just look at it. The best way to look at it is you bet hoping to build a pot when you're a favorite to win the pot, or you bet when you are hoping that your opponent will relinquish their equity, whether they have more equity or less equity. If it's to your advantage that they fold, betting is probably good. They're not going to fold otherwise, right? This notion that tight is right and tighter is righter completely depends on your opponents. If your opponents are nits that don't play enough hands and they open raise some of the time, but they often fold to 3-bets, then tight is wrong. You want to be in there just if they never 3-bet and they fold a lot to 3-bets and they fold a lot to opens. If they're nitty, then tight is not right. You want to play loose aggressive against tight. And if you actually have one player that's a tag, like tight aggressive, and another player that's a lag, loose aggressive beats tight aggressive. Tight aggressive beats calling station, and calling station beats loose aggressive. So you have like this non-linear hierarchy. Tight was only right in 2006 because most of the opposition was loose passive, and tight is right against loose passive. Raise or fold only is strictly false. It is just not the case. Sometimes you should raise, sometimes you should fold. Sometimes you're in a spot where you have 2 decisions, one of them is raise, one of them is fold, and they're close, and calling is not good. But usually, it's not the case that raising and folding are both good options, but calling is bad. Calling is the one in between raising and folding. And oftentimes, the decision is going to be between calling and raising, or calling and folding. And there are some times when it is just clearly the case that your best option is to call. And very often that is when you're out of position with a mediocre strength hand. Why would you raise or fold? You check and you call. When does it make sense to check and call? Well, it makes sense to check and call anytime your hand is not strong enough to bet for value, but too strong to fold. That's pretty natural. It's the most natural thing in the world. You think that your opponent has some hands that beat you, some hands that do not. You're getting pot odds. You think you're high enough up in your range where you need to be calling with some hands, and this is high enough in your range that you shouldn't be folding this. So you check, he bets, and you call, you know? And pre-flop, we already talked about a situation where razor fold only is not, you know, good, but definitely post-flop. I mean, if you have like top pair with a top pair, top kicker, you don't want to just play razor fold with your top pair, top kickers. I know people used to do that. Don't do that. You know, like even on a wet board, it's usually wrong, because I mean, maybe if you're playing heads up and you've got a wet board, you've got top pair, top kicker, and you've got 30 big blinds, 40 big blinds. I mean, maybe there's some tournament spots where it makes sense, but generally speaking, if you have top pair, top kicker, and your opponent bets, you call. If you raise, then yeah, you've got a better chance of winning the pot right now, but that's not what the game is about. The game is not about how many pots you win. It's about minimizing your losses when you don't have the best of it, maximizing your wins when you do. It's 100% mini-max game. If you raise top pair, oftentimes you're only getting called by hands that beat you. It's almost like you're turning top pair into a bluff, but it's not even as good as a bluff, because your opponent's not going to fold anything that beats you, right? It's just wasting your equity. It's wasting your hand. Razor fold only is strictly false. It's not even a good rule of thumb. It's derived, I think, from a bad axiom. And that axiom was that the object of the game was to win the pot when possible, using your cards basically as a backup plan for times when your plan to win the pot failed. That was it. That's how we used to play. We would raise to take down the pot. We would call for pot odds. That was it. You don't do that anymore. You know, you should have never done that. We didn't know better. But you know better now. So stop playing razor fold only. Sometimes you should call. You should more or less typically, most of the time, especially when you're in position, you can think of it like this. You should be raising with the best hands and the worst hands in your range, and you should be calling with the medium hands. If you were pre-flop razor, very often that's also the case, especially against a player who's not paying attention and will allow you to polarize your c-betting range without beating you up for it. It's often the case that you should c-bet your value hands, continuation bet your bluffs, and check the rest back. You know, check your bluff catchers back and catch bluffs. By the time they check the flop and check the turn, your bluff catcher maybe has turned into a value hand, and you can start betting it for value. Razor fold only is bad poker. If you're never calling, you're not playing well. Yeah, and winning the pot is the primary. And even if this is not something that players say out loud or even think explicitly, if it's not something they believe in terms and in words, it still really seems to be the fallacy upon which everything strategically in the old school was built upon. Winning the pot is not the object of the game, and I can prove it to you. How would you win the most pots you could possibly win? It's easy. You would just never fold, right? You would call every bet on every street, pre-flop, post-flop. You'd play every single hand you have to showdown. If you do that, you will win every single pot you could possibly win. There is no better way to win as many pots as you possibly can win. The problem is, of course, you'll go broke before you get to win as many pots as you could win, so maybe that's not true. But I'm sure you get the spirit of where I'm going with this. The object of the game is to win money. It's to make money with your good hands and lose as little as possible, often nothing, with your bad hands. It's to get money in when you have an edge and try to not put money in without an edge. Even if it's not explicitly stated or believed by lots and lots of players, they still play as if winning the pot was the primary goal. That's why they say things like, I had to 3-bet pre-flop because I thought I had the best hand and I didn't want to give them a chance to outdraw me. That's why they say things like, I had to bet the flop because I wanted to protect my middle pair. I wanted to protect my hand, that's why I bet my second pair with no kicker. Yeah, it's not a valid way to think. So if you're thinking tight is always right, get it out of your head. Tight is sometimes right. It depends on your opponents. If there's a million reasons to bet, if you have more than 3 or 4 reasons that you bet, you're confused, and you need to rethink it and see if you can make things in your mind more efficient, easier to handle. Efficiency, elegance. Let's be eloquent with our thinking. We don't have that much time. We don't have an unlimited amount of time to think about whether we want to make one of 7 types of bets that we have. And plus, it's not true. It's just not true. There could be, some people just say you only ever bet for value or a bluff, and that's not a bad way to play. If you only ever make a bet when you can get called by a worse or fold out better, your game will probably have just improved. I do think there's some more bets than that. I think that I don't think bet for value or bet as a bluff only is strictly true. I don't think it's strictly the case, but it is almost always the case. It's purely the situation you're in on the river, in position, after your check two. If you're planning on going all in, yeah, it's almost never strictly true, but it's usually close enough. It's usually close enough that it's a pretty good way to think. Probably better than the way most players are. It's definitely better than the way most players think. Raise or fold only, strictly false. It's not even a good rule of thumb. You should have calling ranges. You should have raising ranges. You should have folding ranges. You should do something. You should never only raise or fold. Never say never in poker. And winning the pot is the primary. I think we've beat that into the ground. I've got a bunch of other bones to pick with old school tags. And an old school tag, here's how you know if you are one. Okay, you'll know that you're an old school tag if you limp in with all of your suited connectors and your pocket pairs, and you only raise when you've got a big hand, and you play raise or fold with your broadways, you might be an old school tag. A lot of old conventional wisdom arises from incorrect axioms. Axioms are starting beliefs, fundamentals. It's things that, it's the kind of common sense notions that you believe are true. It's your starting points. Your starting axioms are the places where you kind of draw your line in the sand, or it's where you put your foundation down. You lay your foundation. This is my starting axiom. These are the things I know are true, and because I know these things are true, the rest of this is also true. A lot of the old conventional wisdom arises because the starting point was wrong. The axioms were incorrect. So that doesn't mean that we need a small tweaking. We really need to take a hard second look at this. Some of the post-boom paradigm evolved based on a set of metagame dynamics. We talked a little bit about that. And a lot of those metagame dynamics are not true with most populations today, and some are hardly applicable at all. There had to be some kind of archetype or archetypal player. There had to be a player type that would be, win against most. There had to be a best player type. There had to be a best player in 2005. Had to be one, right? There had to be one type of play that won more than the other types. That doesn't mean that's the best way to play. It just means it was the best then, based on things that most have probably changed by now. And that's why most of your good pros are not tight aggressive players anymore. They're loose aggressive. That's because the new rags, the new bad rags, the fish of today are tight aggressives. They're nits. Nits are the new calling stations. And the way to beat the calling stations was to play tight and aggressive. The way to beat the tight aggressive players that really have inherited the game now is to play loose and aggressive. So it's not good to have a style like that in mind and say, I'm always going to play like a tag, or I'm always going to play lag, or I'm always going to be very sticky and station off because my opponents are aggressive. I mean, you want to play a game that's organic and that flows. You don't want to have one style. Your style ought to be whatever style is going to be best against whatever players you're playing against. Much of what was said back in the day is no longer true. Some of what was imagined true never was true. A modern approach to strategic thinking will not simply add to the old school approach, but will instead replace it. Honestly, you've got to rethink your initial starting premises and everything you think you know about No Limit Hold'em. You can still use a lot of the same talents. Um, you're still going to want your card sense, your intuition. You're still going to need your logical thinking and your deductive reasoning. You're still going to need to pay attention and have a good memory. You're still going to need to think of things mathematically, but more so. Back in the day, there used to be players that played mostly by feel, players that kind of tried to go with the math, and it was kind of anybody's game. Nowadays, there's just the people that play the math and the people that put their kids through college. Yeah, or put them through college these days. Let's be honest about it. In conclusion, and that, in theory, is how you play poker. I'm Navinato No Limit Hold'em. Thanks for watching.